Mom? Beautiful. So people are entering the room now, I'm assuming. They're being admitted, right? Mom? Yes. Ah! Hello, beautiful humans! We are super excited today. So to start off with, welcome everybody. I hope you're having a good day wherever you find yourselves and are staying safe. And welcome to our 8th episode of Conversations with Chaeli. I'm so excited for today's session because we have an all-American panel today, and I'm just excited to have this chat and to have these phenomenal humans here with us. And I'm gonna allow each of them to introduce themselves to you in a bit. But first of all, happy Disability Pride Month, everybody. Yay!
Yeah.
um, so I hope you will enjoy our conversation, and please be involved in this chat and introduce yourselves in the chat if you are not on the panel, and engage, ask questions if you have any, and yeah. So I think we will start with intros. So I'm Katie Mycroft. I'm founder and global ambassador for the Katie campaign and also Katie Foundation USA. Um, I am a disabled person. I have cerebral palsy and I'm a wheelchair user forever. So that's my perspective that I'm coming into this conversation with. Um, yes. So I'm going to hand over now to Judy to give a quick intro.
Sorry, I was trying to unmute. First of all, thank you so much for inviting us. I think Brent, he'll introduce himself. We're really happy to be a part of this, and Vicky. And I guess I want to start off by saying I think it was really funny that you said we have an all-American team, because in the States that frequently means football players. And I think none of us probably are. I know I'm not. I am a white 73-year-old disabled woman. I'm sitting in the foyer of our apartment, which is my husband's and my apartment. And we also work. And so behind me is this dining room table where Becca is sitting out of sight right now. I am wearing a floral blouse with red, purple, and white, and have photos and postcards on our walls and plants. Many of those postcards from Brent, who always sends me postcards when he's traveling.
Amazing. Thank you, Judy. And I'm so excited that you're here. Let's go over to Brent because Brent connected us with Judy. So,
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. And Kaylee, thanks for the invite. And Vicky, thanks for the introduction to Zelda and Kaylee. My name is Brent Elder. I'm an inclusive education professor at Rowan University outside of Philadelphia. And I do a lot of work related to the development of sustainable inclusive education practices, both in the United States and in low-resourced countries, most recently Kenya, Rwanda, and Ghana. Judy, thank you for reminding me about the descriptions. I'm sitting in the office of our house. I'm wearing a blue shirt. and headphones. Anyways, it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm happy to discuss all the questions that we have in store for our panel. So thanks for having me.
And if I could just also say, I had polio in 1949. I'm a wheelchair user. The issue of inclusive education is very important to me, both personally and professionally. I was a deputy minister at the U.S. Department of Education under President Clinton, and one of my areas of responsibility was overseeing what was going on in our Office of Special Education Programs, which has the responsibility of both providing financial support that's given to us through the federal government, and then most meaningfully in doing technical assistance, monitoring compliance of the states, as well as awarding grants on a whole variety of issues, including professional development and other forms of technical assistance and research. And I left that position in 2001.
Amazing. Thank you for that added insight. Vicky, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and what you are up to?
What I'm up to? Oh my goodness, that would take a while. But thank you, Chaeli. Appreciate the invitation to join this wonderful conversation and to reconnect again with Judy Heumann. We were able to host Judy at LMU for the celebration a number of years ago with the Americans with Disabilities Act, along with Tony Coelho, and also to join Brent Elder, a friend and colleague who travels the world. I'm a white female disability ally, and I am a professor of special education and inclusive education at Loyola Marymount University. I am getting close to retirement age, so I won't get into the details, but close to retirement age. I'm wearing kind of a reddish purple top, have glasses, kind of blondish brown hair. I'm sitting in my bedroom. Unfortunately, my laptop died yesterday, so I'm on my phone. I don't have a fancy background, what I normally would have. So you'll just see the back wall, and where I'm sitting. But I've been involved in the education of students with disabilities for over 40 years, and have worked at the university preparing educators across all areas. But I'm a passionate supporter of inclusive education, and trying to do that both within the United States, California, as well as internationally as well. So it's a pleasure to join everyone today. Thank you, Chaeli.
Amazing. Thank you for being here. So I guess I should do a bit of a self-description as well here. So I'm in my bedroom with my desk behind me, and I'm wearing a gray hoodie because it's freezing here in Cape Town. I also, I think my passion for inclusion grew out of necessity. I did my university studies. I focused my master's in human rights on the right to basic education for disabled children in South Africa. I'm currently doing my second master's in public law, looking at the role of activism and the treatment of activists within the legal system in South Africa. So that's an interesting situation in this moment. And I have used a motorized wheelchair for the majority of my existence. So I wanted to sort of start this conversation with a bit of a statement and a bit of a question to Judy. because we are in Disability Pride Month, and that's been a really interesting journey for myself, just trying to figure out like disabled pride and disabled joy and all of these kinds of ideas that are relatively new in discussions. And talking about this being or disabled being an identity rather than an affliction or like something that is thrust upon us is a really interesting conversation for me because um, I think people tend to want to remove disability and remove barriers. And when I think about it, you could take away all of the barriers, all the access issues, and all the stigma, and I would still be identifying as a disabled person. And I just wonder for you, Judy, whether that is the case for you or if you've had a different experience with your disability. Oh, you're unmute, Judy. So good.
All right. I was saying, thank you so much for the question. I do many of these, and actually no one has ever asked me a question like that. So I think it'll be great for us to get in a dialogue. It really is an interesting point. And for me, given my age, I don't think there's any remote reality that what you've been discussing could even happen. And I think when looking at the word disabled, it is my identity. And I would say that the only time when that might be something that you may or may not want to utilize is if we are truly in a blended world where we all feel and are able to bring our diversity to the table in a seamless way. I think, because it's a new question, I'm thinking as I'm talking, I would say it's not likely that I would not use that word, since when I think about how I identify myself today, I identify myself as a disabled Jewish woman. And unless there'd be a time where those were not important characteristics about myself or however other people identify, you'd want to use it, because I think it speaks to really who we are. Because I think, our disabilities really bring a richness and a unique way of having to deal with things that I think are disability specific. And I believe, it's such an amazing question, actually. I can't envision, because disability is something like you and I are different. You had your disability at birth. I had polio before I was 2 years old.
Yeah.
And so our whole lives have been as disabled people. One of the things that we talk to people about in Africa, in North America, South America, all over, particularly for those of us in the movement, is how very important it is to identify as having a disability. But those people who are acquiring their disabilities in their teens or 20s, 30s, however old they are, they're still growing up and will be growing up, I think, for a long time, where having a disability is not considered to be equal. And one of the important aspects of the movement is to allow disabled people to value themselves for who they are. And when disability becomes a part of who they are, to be able to assist people in recognizing the transitions they're going to have to go through in some cases, and really helping people, because in many ways, many people who acquire disabilities also stigmatized people with disabilities. And so now they're one of the people that they didn't feel comfortable with, felt were not equal to them. And so I think there's just such a multifaceted aspect of what we need to be looking at. So I guess the simple answer to your question is, yes, I always think it'll be a part of who I am and who we are.
Amazing. Thank you for that. I also think it's really interesting that I was recently sort of confronted with this idea that, like, because everyone's on board with the disabled is not a bad word mission, right? And I saw a, a content the other day that was speaking about how disabled is an identity to embrace, but abled is also an identity that people carry around without knowing. Like, it's a privilege that isn't recognized at the
I don't
level.
like the fact that the word able is only used in the context of disability.
Totally.
So we don't say that. It may be implied that people believe that women are less capable,
Yeah.
but you don't see this play on the word able. And I think really it's, for me, one of the issues around people trying to stigmatize the word disabled and disability by crossing off the dis, capitalizing the A, or whatever ridiculous set of words they use. Is they don't do that for other groups. If the other groups themselves decide that they want to change the word, like the word handicap, which was not our word ever anyway. And then when we started changing it, and then in the States, this big struggle about whether or not we would use people with disabilities versus disabled people. And that goes on and on. But we are the ones that need to determine our language. And it is implied for me that all people have capability, all people have abilities. What we do to support those abilities is one of the reasons why we're talking today. Right? What does segregation and exclusion mean for disabled people or other populations of people who are marginalized through segregation and inferior education and low expectations, and the biases that come along with not believing that children with disabilities or from other backgrounds can never achieve what the majority population can achieve.
100%.
Yeah.
So I
think Brent wants to jump in for a second.
Yeah, and I know, Chaeli, you were really interested in talking about the role of allyship, right? And so I identify as non-disabled, and I'm an educator strongly positioned with inclusive education. And so prior to understanding things about disability identity and getting a stronger understanding of inclusive education, I would write IEP goals for like making eye contact or not flapping hands and those normalizing sort of goals. And I didn't realize that that's pretty damaging to someone who has, I should be developing a prideful autistic identity with students or a prideful disability identity within schools, and modeling that language and those practices within the things I'm doing. And so piggybacking off of what Judy was saying, I'm really listening to people within the disability community as allies or otherwise, and adjusting our practices to support that sort of identity development from a very young age, I think is very important.
So I also would like to jump in as well, as being an educator who's been in the field for over 40 years. My experience, my understanding has really evolved over time. I mean, it's interesting when Brent talked about the IEP goals that he would write. because when I worked initially at UCLA at the end early childhood program, we did try and normalize these children, you know, who had autism, who would be flapping and doing things because we wanted them to look normal. I mean, that was what we were trying to do. This was like 40 years ago. But over time, I think, you know, as an ally, I've tried to kind of step back and really listen to both children and adults with disabilities to try and better understand their reality. And I think as an ally, that's really what one of my main goals is, to really help individuals more or less understand it, or at least come to understand and to listen to individuals with disabilities. I mean, I'm constantly trying to help with the use of language, the term special needs. I hear this term special needs. I mean, it's like people are afraid to use the word disability or disabled, that they are much more comfortable with using a term special needs, not realizing what the implication is of using that. And you know, and it's, you know, and sometimes people go, there she goes again, she's, you know, monitoring what we're saying. Well, I'm not trying to monitor what people say, but it's to really value, you know, the experience of disabled people. And so it's an interesting, you know, journey. I think that both Brent and I, probably, he's younger than I am, but that we've been on as disability allies. So I
Yeah,
appreciate this conversation.
awesome.
You know,
And
I want to raise something because I think the discussion about disabled people with autism is a very valuable one. I also started thinking about, I don't know what it was like in South Africa, but before the 1970s, maybe the mid 1970s, people who whose disability was Down syndrome were being dressed in a very infantile way. Their hair was being cut in my view, pretty ugly. And you've seen, and many people, you know, with Down syndrome were being institutionalized. The changes that I think we've seen within the development, within the Down syndrome community, I think are very important. And this is where I believe the issue, not just of quote unquote special education teachers, but healthcare providers and community people play a very important role. These young children were being stigmatized immediately by the fact that they were not wearing the same types of clothes, that their hair was so similar, that they stood out, even if you were trying to facilitate inclusion or integration or just normal community life. So I think one of the values of what Brent and Vicki have been saying is really the need for collaboration. I'm not so big on the word ally. I know a lot of people use it, but I don't feel like I call myself an ally for other groups. It's like, you know, we're friends, we're colleagues, we're people who value a diverse community. But anyway, I think it's really important that we are able to facilitate some of these discussions and with an ultimate objective, because really, I think what's been so important about the autistic movement is the emergence of, it's not the emergence of leaders, because the leaders were there, but the ability of the leaders to form organizations, to get financial support, to recognize the need for these kinds of organizations, and to be able to reach out to disabled people with autism, and when they're younger, with their families, because, you know, the issue of normalizing, when children are children, it's the parents that are basically expected, appropriately so, to be the leaders of what's going on. So if the parents are also struggling with things like, well, my child looks so different because they're not making eye contact, or they're flapping their hands, or they're jumping up and down, or whatever it is, there needs to be a way for people to be assisting the parent in meeting other parents who have children, and in my perspective, adults, because I think it is important for families to have an understanding of adults with a disability that your child has, and to be able to see the successes and not, the typical representation in media of the failures, quote unquote. So this discussion, Chaeli, is rich for so many different reasons, but I think it's really bringing some very important points forward that people viewing today, I'm sure, share many of them, and learning about how people are addressing these issues, I think, is important.
I think what I get excited about and I'm gonna backtrack a little bit here. I think disability is really complicated and complex because I've been disabled for 27 years almost, and I'm still confused about a lot of things about my own disability, and that's a journey in itself. And every disabled person has their own journey with their disability. And so I think that makes it complicated to address at like a societal level, but also in terms of like making space for everybody to have a unique experience of disability and for them to embrace their own journeys um, in understanding what their disability means for them in their lives. We here in South Africa, in Cape Town, we have started an inclusive early childhood preschool, essentially, and it's got disabled and non-disabled kids, and they learn in the same spaces, and we have therapies that happen in the classrooms, because you shouldn't be removed from school just because you have to go have like a physio session or something. So the kids around the disabled kids are learning that it's normal. I don't like using the word normal, but it's normal that people have different ways of learning and that people have different body situations, and like it's all okay, and everything that happens is valid. And so they're kind of learning how to engage as 3-year-olds with disabled people in a way that is really quite special. And I think what I love about learning from kids is that kids are kind of just curious. And I think often like adult logic is projected onto the kids when they're just really wanting to know why you're in a wheelchair, and then you can tell them and they're like, okay, cool, bye. And then they move on. And so I think that kind of stigma and the sort of awkwardness and embarrassment and all of those negative feelings are sort of put on kids when they don't inherently have that um, initial response. Brent, you had a
Yeah,
comment?
Kaylee, what you're talking about, I think, is really important because we have to be putting kids together to learn from and with one another. You also mentioned the important role of adults. And so I think, yes, inclusive education practices are important in schools and employment across the board, right? But I find where the sort of strong foundation where the rubber meets the road with this sort of stuff, with these discussions, is that, yeah, sure, we know that inclusive practices are important, but we have to understand the history of disability oppression, the history of disability marginalization, the fight for disability rights in South Africa, in the US, across the world. And that adds more gravity to the why. On top of that, there's international disability rights laws and domestic disability rights laws. So we're not saying, should we do this? We say, how should we do this? And we have to understand the history of oppression. And so people go, oh, and so we know better ways of moving forward. Because I don't like to get into the debate of whether or not we're doing this. Sure, we need to say, yeah, we're fluent at creating inclusive environments, and these are some strategies, but we have to be talking about a social justice foundation too, a legal and a social justice foundation. And that's where I feel the history of the disability rights movement in the United States and around the world is really important. And then really, and saying that we can't do what we've been doing forever because it's not socially just, it's immoral. And once we know better, we have an ethical obligation to do something different moving forward. And that kind of stops that debate. And I'm like, I'm not wasting my time and I'm not wasting your time. We're moving forward.
Yeah.
Yeah, I want to second what Brent is saying in terms of the importance of teaching disability history, the disability rights movement. I taught a class this spring for our undergraduates, and many of them had experience in working in, various high schools and camps and so forth with children, young adults with disabilities, but had no idea about the discrimination and the institutionalization and the horrible treatment historically of persons with disabilities. And they were shocked that they had never learned this, that it took them to be juniors and seniors in college to learn about disability history. And we're wondering, why is this not included in our curriculum? And of course, we're having this conversation nationally in the United States about, the teaching of history. Now, of course, it has to do with race, but we need to also look at the history as it impacted disabled people. And I think too, within the conversation about equity and justice, human rights, and the U.S. has not ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities or the rights of children and so forth. We have the Americans with Disabilities Act, but we have to understand the history. If we just to say we have to do it because it's the law, then you get people resisting that and resenting that. But if they understand the history of why we have the law, then I think we can make, some progress.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, Vicky, that you bring up the UNCRPD, because I have, it's intriguing to me that the US does not sign these conventions. And it's more intriguing just because I come from South Africa and we kind of sign everything. So it's just an interesting difference. Do you guys think that it is like a difference of approach to reaching certain objectives for disability, or do you like, I don't know, what are your thoughts on the UNCRPD and like the international sort of commitments that those conventions represent, I guess?
I mean, I would say, this is Judy, I would say, in the US, the issue around the convention and why we haven't ratified the convention, the US has many treaties that we have not ratified. And so on the one hand, the CRPD not being ratified, it's not the first time this has happened. And I also feel like, given a different change. The way ratification goes in the United States, it's the US Senate that recommends to the president ratification. And we need 2/3 of the Senate making this recommendation. So it's intended to be something which is more difficult. And I would say that the issues that we have had when trying to get the Senate to recommend ratification stems around a couple of issues. One, Republicans, not all, but many, do not like the UN. So anything which is UN related, they may not come to the table at all. We were able to get all the Democrats to support the ratification, but could not get to the 67 that we needed. So I would say hope is the wrong word. I do think it's something that we can potentially be looking at. Also with the disability rights groups in the US, there's not been that much knowledge about international issues. And so the more I think the disability community can continue to be educated about the need for the US to ratify, and there were some really good efforts that were going on between 2010, 11 until about 2015, when it was clear we were not going to be able to get around the Republicans, but more and more people becoming educated. And I think the US has been benefiting from working with countries like Japan and others who are doing a lot of international work. So there is a slow evolution going on there. Even though we haven't ratified, USAID and the State Department still not only are doing some work in the area internationally, in the area of disability, but it's becoming a bigger focus. So I think one of the influences of the disability rights community and work going on around CRPD to get it ratified is we've been exposing the fact that state and USAID have not been integrating disability into their grant making significantly enough. So I think we are seeing some changes there slowly.
Awesome. I think what is really quite frustrating for me as a disabled person is that people kind of like progress is slow, and this is kind of a go-to thing of like how, but we have these policies, and like South Africa is really good at the policies. We have policies and they've integrated like disability into the different policies. So South Africa took that path instead of doing like what America did with the ADA. It was, we're going to integrate disability into every other policy, but it sort of becomes a footnote rather than a key element to implementing things. And I think we have a tendency in South Africa to sign the conventions and then we're not implementing them. So that's a frustration for me that we have to work on. And I'm just wondering how you three feel about like where do you think is the most effective place to start with advocating? Because we have this cycle of it's not accessible, So disabled people don't go because they can't get into a building. So there are no disabled people in the building. So there's an argument that no disabled people come here. So they never they never fix the accessibility issues because there's an idea that it's not needed by the disabled community. And that's how do we tackle that?
I think it's a great example, because you'll also hear, like, an organization will make a meeting accessible and then complain that no one came. So why should we make this meeting accessible if no one comes, or very few people come, or they don't continue to come? And I think it fits very nicely into what you're saying about not participating. Very similar. I think the reality is people go to things where they can get to them, and people go to things where they feel valued, and people go to things, there may be many reasons someone isn't going, and disability may be the least of it. They may have a child and not have babysitting. They may not be able to get a ride to the event, but really want to go to the event. I think people need to understand it's the same thing. If you're like a woman without a disability, you may not be going to the meeting because the topic doesn't interest you. You didn't even know there was a meeting. They didn't provide certain things that you needed. And I feel like, and Chaeli, I can't speak for you, so I'll just speak for myself on this, but I'm always feeling guilty, right? We didn't go to this event. Then I finally started recognizing that I shouldn't feel guilty. You know, many organizations don't get the number of people that they want to come or get them to be committed. And if disability is not part of the equation, they typically will look at what do we need to do differently. Instead of blaming the people that didn't come, they're looking at what are we not doing right to get those people there. And I think that's where we need to be in disability. And I also feel like, I can again just speak for myself, but for many years, I didn't want to go to these meetings to be the only disabled person. So I would try to get somebody else to go with me to the meeting. So if I felt like I was being stared at or people were being patronizing or whatever, at least I wouldn't have to just be in my own head. I could be whispering to my disabled friend or non-disabled friend or whatever. And so that's what I'm saying. It's important for us also, I think, as you were saying, to venture forth and to take risks, to go into environments that we have a legitimate reason not to feel comfortable in. And I think those people need to understand that just because they set a table, that doesn't mean I have to occupy a chair if I'm not feeling valued by the group.
I also want to contribute here a little bit. When I work with disability communities in rural Kenya or wherever, and we invite disabled community members, disabled students, parents of disabled people, you know, to the table, the first thing they usually say is, I've never been asked to be here before. No one's ever cared about my perspective. And that's very common. Or they say, I've been invited, but I can't afford to get there. So I need, you know, subsidized transport or gas or whatever it is. Or I'm working 4 jobs and I don't have the resources to get here because it's about survival. And I've never been valued at this conversation before. And so I think that's a really important piece to think about too, is, you know, for me, when I'm going into a space as an outsider to do research, I have to be really thoughtful about the ethics of the situation and understand, you know, it's like, I can invite you, but if I don't meaningfully like solicit and value your information and then apply it in some tangible fashion, what's the point? And so I think that's, you know, sort of relates to what Judy was saying about, you can invite people all day long, but if you historically have ignored them, why would they engage? There's not any precedent for anything different.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of pressure in that, especially when you like I am an activist and um I appreciate that my disability is very visible and it's very obvious to people. So I don't have the challenge of disclosing my disability. It's very much people know. And so I've I appreciate that I have never had the I've never felt that people looking at me was a patronizing thing as um as a child. I didn't feel that. Was I'm very grateful that I have a sense of self-worth that is not determined by other people um, being confused about why I'm in a room. And I I think I've sort of learned to be loud about my disability as a way to engage and um, and have people sort of question um, why they are curious or why they are looking at disabled people in a certain way. But I'm very much about experiences, and so I feel like if a building is inaccessible to me, it's not acceptable that I need assistance to get into that building. But I do also feel that um, if you help me into a building and you lifting my wheelchair that weighs 60 kilograms, you're gonna remember that experience next time and be like, oh, this building is not accessible. Um, and I think sometimes we have to play the long game, um, which is hard because sometimes you just want to get into a building and it shouldn't be hard to do that, but it is sometimes. So I wanted to ask Vicky a question first. So we've worked together a lot, and you've done work internationally as well. And obviously, every country has its own situation regarding disability and attitudes and everything. What do you think are some things that you've learned from working in like developing countries or countries that don't have super resources that are being put towards disability advocacy? What do you think are some things that you can bring back to the US that have been lessons for you or eye-opening experiences?
Wow, Kaylee.
Sorry,
Excellent
that's
question.
17 questions or
No, that's an excellent question, but, I have to kind of step back and think a bit, but, the United States, because we have the federal law, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, we've had, I think, a perspective of compliance, and sort of ticking the boxes and not really getting down to some of the issues that we've talked about today. And I think for educators, as even as I'm, working both at the university as well as in local schools, we have to get beyond the laws and so forth and really get down to the human interaction and understanding and looking at families and so forth. And so in some ways, I think that some of the developing countries, while they have many, 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 many challenges, I think have a great opportunity to develop a system of support for children and individuals with disabilities that gets away from a compliance perspective. And I think, even, with the CRPD, you're looking at the rights of a human being. What are the rights of a human being, a person who exists in this world because they breathe, because they are a human being. And I think we have the opportunity with some countries to really focus on that. Brent can easily speak to that as well. But I think if we bring that back to the United States and really look at it as the whole child perspective, I mean, we have a participant on this call, Kristen Wright, who has been putting some things in the chat. And we were just talking yesterday about what we call intersectionality, of looking at what it is to be a whole person in terms of, whether it's our gender, our race, our ethnicity, our language, uh, disability, and so forth. We look at the whole person. And I think if we can keep cultivating that in developing countries and then bring that back to the US, I think that could be a great advantage. I do want to call out some of the work that, the Chaeli Foundation, Chaeli campaign has done in terms of inclusive preschools. I really think that is dramatic. And I think Kristen, again, who's on this call, has been a huge supporter and proponent of inclusive early education. Because I think if families, and again, I think the role of the parents and the families are so critical, because I think when you have resistance to inclusive education from various, families, it's from fear, it's from anxiety, it's not knowing what is to be expected. And so I think the work that the Chaeli campaign on inclusive early childhood or early education has been so supportive. And I think if we can bring that back to the US as well, I think that'll also be incredibly helpful.
Thanks, Vicky. Yay! um, I really appreciate that you're also such a strong supporter of our work, and I think that's important to build a community around the work that needs to happen, because I think a lot of speaking happens and people dialogue all the time, and they're like, oh, let's do a conference on how we can make the world more inclusive, but then nothing happens after that when people go home. And I think that's an important aspect to consider, is how do we get the idea of disabled people and the lives that we lead and the equity, how do you get that idea into households and grassroots level? Yeah, I guess that's my question.
I want to add in as well, when we're talking about large international development organizations like USAID or others who work on inclusive education, oftentimes you have this network of NGO actors that are implementing inclusive education, rather than those supports being adopted by the government and saying, in our government, our teacher ed curriculum supported by the government, we're going to have history of disability legislation, inclusive education practice, and have that be actually adopted by government. So it's not just this patchwork of NGOs doing inclusive education, and then when the grant ends or whatever project ends, everything falls apart. So that's one issue of international inclusive ed stuff in low resource countries. And then I also think, to Vicky's point, I do a lot of community-based participatory research. So we do smaller scale projects, but they center the perspectives of kids with disabilities, of teachers at special schools and teachers at primary schools, and how to break down those barriers between those two types of institutions, and centering the perspectives of other disabled people in the community. Anybody so that really localizes the priorities. And then we try to use that as a model to show, you know, on to a Ministry of Education, for example, look at the promising practices in this smaller region of the country. If the government wanted to, they could scale up on certain levels as well. Not saying that that works all the time, but there are things that are happening in each country. And if we understand what those things are, we're not recreating the wheel and then, you know, showing governments promising practices.
Yeah.
I think this is, again, a really great question. And I look at it from a number of different vantage points. One is most disabled people, as I mentioned earlier, do not acquire their disabilities when they're younger. Therefore, they have no real knowledge and experience about the quality or type of education disabled children experience. Given everything else that they're dealing with in their day-to-day lives, even for those who are doing disability rights work, their lack of knowledge and exposure makes this an issue that they don't necessarily have time for. And I think, you know, when I worked at the Berkeley Center for Independent Living, I was on the board in 73 and 76, I went on staff. And one thing that I really worked on doing was, and then we had some younger people from the East Coast who had experiences with discrimination in trying to get into school and being in segregated classes, on and on. Bringing some of those people into the organization that was primarily dealing with young adults through seniors was very important, because then, like anything, they brought a new perspective. And what we saw over a number of years was that new perspective developed programs for parents. So we applied for a grant where we had parents that were hired to do advocacy work with other parents. And then some of our services began to be utilized by younger people. So I think we have to recognize, and here in the United States, with a decreasing birth rate, less families having kids going to school, less invested in what's going on, it's kind of something they're hearing. Maybe they do or don't have grandchildren, but we need to get people invested in, why is education an important issue for our country? Who are those people that are not benefiting? And it's not just disabled children. You also raised an important point earlier, Chaeli, around you know, diverse learners. And I think one of the, I'm presuming with Brent and Vicki, that one of the issues that gets talked about is special ed is not just effectively teaching teachers about how to work with kids who have disabilities in inclusive settings does not just benefit those children. And training general ed teachers to be able to be knowledgeable about how to address inclusion of disabled children, including academic qualifications for accommodations, et cetera, does not just benefit disabled students. It benefits all students who are marginalized, where there's been an approach. And I think, you know, in South Africa and other countries where you have large classroom sizes, 40, 50, 60 kids, teachers are not appropriately trained because they don't have degrees or any of this. There's a complexity of issues. But I think one of the points we need to continually be driving forward, and I know that Brent does this in work that he's doing both in the States and outside, and Vicki too, is we are talking about reforming education to be able to ensure that children, some of whom have disabilities, some of whom are poor, from the Black and Brown Indigenous communities, these marginalized populations have, and the failure for them to get education, have a long-term impact on the economic capacity of our countries. And I think giving examples of children who were throwaway kids, regardless of the communities they were in, and then to be able to show the positive impact that quality education has on disabled children and others, and getting these messages out more broadly. I think one issue is very much where governments are not in the area of education, including education of disabled kids in departments of education, or the programs that are monitoring and doing work in the area of special ed are not brought to the table of the ministers on education, but are marginalized. So, and I think, you know, Chaeli, it's working with adults who have disabilities when they were younger. Yes, bring along others. But what I think is very important is I don't know your story at all in this area, but my story is not an atypical one of being denied the right to go to school, then being in segregated classes and not receiving an equal education for no other reason than I had a disability or I couldn't walk. So we need to be the ones driving this because we've got the knowledge and the real commitment to making sure that this is not repeated generation after generation.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. I think it's important to recognize the power that disabled people have, and that we are a segment of the population that can actually can and does create change. I think it's opening the eyes of the broader community to the work that is happening and the way that we need to bring other people on board with that journey as well. So
And
thank
I
you
think
for
we need to have an urgency.
yes.
There are plenty of models out there, and we shouldn't have to be doing any more of this stupid model stuff. It's got to be integrated into what's going on within whoever's administering it.
Yeah.
And there has to be accountability.
Yeah.
And that's difficult.
And I think we do a lot of theorizing, and that's cool. But I think we need action at this point
We need
now.
trained teachers. We need administrators who believe that disabled children have the right to receive an equivalent education in an inclusive setting. We need labor unions and others behind this. We need accountability so that the universities are in fact recruiting people who are interested in working with disabled children in inclusive settings, giving them the education, the technical assistance, the ongoing support to be able to do this in trying situations.
And I think we go between like it's not that hard to like it's really hard, and you kind of have to balance those sort of attitudes towards disability. And I think one thing, Brent, I'm going to give you the floor in a second, but I think one thing that we need more of is we need more representation. Right? I think in all spaces, we need to see more disabled people. We need to have more like movies about disability. We need
I would try to
more
park in that circle. Let me know when you're almost here and I'll come down.
visibility of disabled people. And I think it's slowly happening. and there are things
I think,
that
yes, it is.
bring people together with people with completely different
12 o'clock.
disability experiences are there are commonalities as well. I want to do a quick thing about Crip Camp. I watched that movie and I cried a lot in that movie.
And why
But
did you cry, Chaeli?
I think it's like a recognition of the work and the lives that we lead as disabled people, not being seen and appreciated and valued. And like that hit me really hard. And I was so excited that that movie exists now because I think it shows the reality of the what it's like to be disabled, but it also shows that we are powerful and that we can make things happen and that we have stamina like to take on like the system. And like that was just remarkable to me as a 26-year-old to be seeing the work that has happened for decades um, before before me, and that all the work is it accumulates, um, and it leads to good things, but we have to be persistent and not let things go. Um, and that was really powerful for me. And the fact that it was recognized in the way that it was with the nomination and the Peabody, like that's an amazing thing as well because it's bringing it into spaces where it wouldn't normally be.
And I think, Chaeli, that one of the powerful parts about that film, and I agree with everything you said, right? The fact that it was a story which spanned decades and it showed power and it showed the ability to make change and it showed community and community engagement beyond disability. But I also want to say that I know in South Africa, there's been amazing work that's gone on for decades. And to me, it feels like what's important is to be working with people like documentary filmmakers to get these stories told. But one of, not but, and like one of the critical parts of this film was this footage that they found that had been taken in 1971. It is not frequent that we're taking footage that may or may not ever be used. And, I think we need to be trying to document things so that when and if an opportunity happens, to be able to be making a film or using it as an example, that it's available. And so, and I know in South Africa, you also have disabled filmmakers, and in the States, we have a new group which has been formed called Forward Doc, which is a group of disabled documentarians who have been getting together to set up an organization to support other disabled people in making documentaries. So, and I don't know if this is your field, but, finding out who some of the other filmmakers are on campuses in the community, because what you're doing in focusing on early childhood in education and doing it in an inclusive way, you could make a very nice piece. You don't need a full-fledged film company. you can have, that discussion around the table with the campers. That was something that came about because this local company thought, oh, we'll bring these video cameras to the camp. They got permission, and they had a couple of video cameras that they gave to Jimmy and another person, I think. And one of the things the campers did was to decide, okay, they wanted to have a discussion about the role of parents. That was not something that was a scheduled activity by the camp, but it was an opportunity that came about because of the video cameras. So, you could see doing something like that, bringing kids and parents together, parents with kids with disabilities without, did you have reservations about coming here? Why did you want your children to be here? What do you see as the benefit? Little appropriately asked interviews with the kids. It could be something very short, but very meaningful, because it's something you could share with other early intervention programs about how to do it, why it's important. So I think media is something that we need to look at using much more frequently, and looking at how we can be sharing more of this.
Judy, I want to give an example as well. I think using platforms like WhatsApp, for example, what we've done in Ghana and Rwanda is we've asked teachers to take snapshots of promising practices of inclusion, and all the teachers that we're working with USAID in Rwanda or whatever country, then they say, hey, this is me. I had someone come in my classroom, my administrator, head teacher, and they filmed my co-taught lesson for 5 minutes. Or maybe it's even like a 30-second clip of kids playing together on the playground inclusively. And then that gets shared on a platform. And then those videos are used as evidence, even small little tidbits of inclusive evidence. And then you can take those, aside from being evidence for the project being effective, you can take it to the government and say, when we say inclusive education, here's a concrete example that happened yesterday, right? And then using those videos for a variety of reasons. And I think that is something that's missing when we talk about government saying we want to do this. It's not because they don't really want to, it's they don't really know how. And when I go into a country that has few resources, they're like, what do you mean inclusive education? We don't even have books. We don't have running water. We don't have, all these other excuses. And I'm like, well, we have to, let's figure it out. And let's document these small stories of inclusion that would otherwise go unseen or unexperienced. And so I think that social media is a really powerful opportunity. And I'm hoping that more international development organizations and governments are looking in that direction.
Yeah, storytelling is a really powerful tool, and it's also an empowering experience for the person telling their story, I feel. I'd like to go to Vicky for any, well, this goes to all three of you, I guess. Any closing comments or ideas or thoughts or anything that you'd like to add to this conversation for people to take away and think about?
Well, I apologize. I have garbage trucks going up and down my street. So you're going to have a lot of background noise, unfortunately, or a jet flying over. So it's the trials and tribulations of Zoom, I'm afraid, at home. But Chaeli, I think just having this conversation with Judy and Brent and yourself, I mean, it's been a wonderful opportunity for us to share our experiences, our perspectives, and our hopes for the future. I know there's some people on this call, both from California, as well as other places in the US and also across Africa. So I think this is a very powerful tool that you've developed, Chaeli, with the conversations and so forth. And again, using social media to get the word out, I think is incredibly, beneficial. I on a personal level, I just feel incredibly privileged to have been working in this field. And as I said, I'm getting close to retirement age, but that's not going to stop me from continuing to do this work. It'll be a lifelong commitment for myself. But I don't have any other parting words except to say thank you for coordinating this. I'd love to open it up to some of the people on the call also, if they would like to share any comments and perspectives. I think Chaeli, I think that would also be helpful, but I'll turn it over to Brent and to Judy for any last thoughts. Thank you, Chaeli.
I'm the same. I feel privileged to be here as well. I always enjoy these types of conversations. I feel it's another way to have this be an accessible format and people can see the kind of internet transnational dialogue. And I'm happy to answer questions or whatever as well.
Yeah. Okay. Does anybody have a question or a comment or input into this conversation? I'm gonna give it a couple minutes to warm up the chat.
I would say that as people are maybe writing a question in the chat, that it's important also for us to document the experience of teachers. Teachers who maybe were reluctant, but have now seen its value. Teachers that are in training, that are learning, and then going in the classroom. I think the ability to dispel some of the myths. When you look at some of the children that have been excluded, and this is true in the past in the States, less true today, but in many other countries, that even a child who could get themselves to school, who may have a physical disability, may be being denied the right to an education just because of prejudice around disability. So we are really in many ways talking about kids who have more significant learning needs and really need adaptations to curricula. But people like yourself and myself, I can't speak for you, but I did not need accommodations to the curricula. I needed a willingness to let me in the classroom. So if we can't get the children in the classroom who need little to no accommodations, maybe a desk which is higher, a ramp into the school, a bathroom that some schools do and don't have, making sure the bathroom is basically accessible. If we can't get those basic things, then it becomes obviously much more difficult to be able to work with children who in fact do have accommodation needs. Not that those needs are not able to be accommodated in many ways, but if the basic bias against disabled people being able to benefit from education, I think is one of the major issues that we're battling. Because once people believe, and disabled and non-disabled educators understand that disabled kids can be benefited by education, they can become a part of the internal voices going on in government, in ministries of education, in local school districts. But if you don't have people within those environments that really believe in this, it makes it more difficult. Not at all that you don't do it, and obviously you keep fighting for it, but we also need disabled people being hired in these positions, in ministries of education, in local school districts, as teachers, as, you know, whatever other kinds of positions are available.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Everybody in the chat is just like, this has been a thought-provoking, meaningful conversation. Thank you for sharing. All stories and lived experiences are important. I'm so happy that we've had this discussion. And I think disability is a topic that we can talk about forever. And all different aspects. There's so many different levels and different things to consider.
I
And
just want to say also that talking is really important, but action is equally important. And what I think is important about the work that you're doing is you're doing a combination. And I think the people that I know here are doing the same. Talking for the purpose of exploring, talking for the purpose of looking at policies that need to be changed, supporting parent advocates and disabled advocates to understand education, getting more disabled people into higher education, to be studying in this field, in policy, teaching, etc. So it's talking for the purposes of action.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's a beautiful way to end this conversation. I am so grateful to all of you for being here. Go and find some
Someone
information.
wrote a question here, I'm sorry. In California, we have some legislation in play to put LRE, least restrictive environment, into our accountability dashboard. I'm curious if you have any thoughts about that as we try to bring transparency to exclusion. The fact that it hasn't been there is outrageous. And I think it speaks to the fact of why things aren't happening. If you can't count it, if you can't see it, if you skip the seeing, if you can't count it, if you can't touch it, if you can't evaluate it, no one feels accountable. So I would say fight like hell for it and oppose anyone who says no.
I like it. You gotta be badass sometimes. Badass.
Always.
Yeah.
You're a badass and own it and feel proud of it.
And claim it and like occupy space loudly sometimes. Most of the time. I want to quickly do a little bit of a plug. So I have just finished my book. It's coming out soon. I'm so excited. It's called Unapologetically Able. And
what is it called?
Unapologetically Able. I'm gonna ask my mom to put the link in the chat for me. To go and sign up for the email updates about when the book is coming. You can go to www.chaeli.co.za. It's in the chat now. I'm so excited to share my book with people and to share some insider info on my disabled experience. And I think that that is an important thing, to claim your own experience as powerful and meaningful, and being brave enough to share it with other people. And I think, Judy, you've done that for forever, and you, like, Brent and Vicky, you've been supporters for a really long time, and I think that's how we're gonna move forward, is just collaborating and bringing everybody into a space where we can share knowledge and appreciate the details of everybody's experience.
So I think buying your book, I'd also suggest that people can go to Netflix or to YouTube to view Crip Camp. I have 2 books out. One is called Being Human, spelling it like my last name, which has been picked up by, I don't know if you're part of the British Commonwealth, because the book has been picked up and I think it should be being distributed, but you can get it on Amazon. And also we have a young adult version that just came out called Rolling Warrior. But I really want to underscore what Chaeli is saying about her book and other books. And films, one of the ways that people learn, teachers and just students, is reading books that tell stories, as Chaeli is saying, the ability to tell our story, and stories of teachers like Vicky and Brent and Zelda and those of you on this call today. Those stories are really important.
So thank you, everybody. Super happy that you've all been here. Thank you for sharing and staying and being a part of our conversation. And stay tuned for like more information and go be curious. Awesome. Thanks, Suzanne.